Hello and welcome back to Bites of History with Irene Walton. I'm your host, Irene Walton, and I'm sure you can tell by the title of this video and the thumbnail.
Have you ever wondered how it made it to your table? Have you ever wondered how it made it to your shelf? If you love food, then this is the show for you. Bites of History with Irene.
This is a video about the Great Boston Molasses Flood of 1919. Now, while that title is relatively intuitive, I'm sure you can sort of glean what this episode will be about. There's a flood of molasses at some point. But what leads up to this traumatic, horrible event is wildly important historically, and what comes after also changes the life in America forever. So I figure we'll start at the beginning and we will end at the end. And you guys, this one is so insane, partly because I had quite literally never heard about this. I don't know if you guys have, but it definitely feels like something that should be more talked about because, oh my gosh, we're going to set the scene a little bit. In the 1880s to the 1920s, so a little bit before, during, and after all of the time, World War I, a lot of Eastern European immigrants were emigrating to the United States, and especially a lot of Italians and generally in the East Coast area. Now, a lot of these Italians went to New York, and a lot of these Italians went to Boston. We're going to be focusing on Boston for this episode. Now, these Italian immigrants were finding themselves in the north end of Boston. Now, this is a very historic part of Boston. Granted, I've never been to Boston. I would really love to go. It's one of like the states I want to... States, okay. Listen, I know it is not a state. I meant cities. I mean, I want to go to Massachusetts. I am terrible at geography, though. Okay. So the north end of Boston is really, really well known. Before America even got its independence, the north end was already like a place. Like Paul Revere had a house there back, when he was around. So there were some affluent families living there, but socioeconomically, it was pretty diverse. Like there were wealthy families, and then there were, craftsmen and artisans and laborers and stuff. So it wasn't just one or the other. However, by the late 1840s, the North End had developed a red light district, and it was just becoming a place where some people didn't want to be, some people didn't want to be raising their families there. And so with a lot of people moving away from it, a lot of immigrants started to move into the North End. So it was becoming a very immigrant dense area to live in Boston. So as more immigrants are moving, there's a lot more commercial development in the North End as well. One very highly dense part of the commercialization was a place called Commercial Street, which is where a lot of people communed. There were a lot of buildings. There was a lot of, business happening on Commercial Street. And that is like one of these main stretches through the North End. Also, if I'm getting any of the geography of Boston wrong, I'm sorry. I've never been there, so I've never actually seen it. But this is what it looked like on maps. So by 1919 in the North End, about 98% of the people living there were Italian immigrants. And if you remember from our Chef Boyardee episode, you may remember that Italian immigrants were very much not liked in America at this time. This was kind of their area. Many of them did not speak English. Many were laborers, and they weren't treated very well or given very much attention from the city either. And they're in this area that is so commercialized. It's very much about business. A lot of people go in and come out, and these people, a lot of people go in for work and then leave to go home afterwards. These people live right there. If you know anything about wartime history timelines, which I think we all know, I do not. You may know that in 1919, we had just come out of World War I. And during war times, a lot of production of, in our Chef Boyardee episode, of food gets ramped up, of, weapons get ramped up, of just a lot of production gets going during the war. And when the war is over, that, eventually comes back down to its average pace, but it's still coming off of that wave. So with that, one of the companies that was helping to make bombs for the war effort was needing to put all of their extra bomb stuff somewhere, pretty much, so that they could go through it slower and, it just simply wasn't as needed. So one of the parts of bomb making, is this video going to get flagged? I'm not telling anyone how to make bombs. I'm just saying that this is how it happens, which is different. Part of the bombs that were being made were using alcohol, like industrial strength, industrial level alcohol. It's not like when you go to the bar and get a margarita. It's not that kind of alcohol. But it is technically like the same compound. It's ethanol and it's like a distilled type of process. There's alcohol. Is the moral of the story there. And to make alcohol, you have to have raw materials in order to do so. So like you might know that potatoes make vodka or agave makes tequila. And it's a process of getting all those ingredients together, letting it ferment, letting it distill, whatever. Now, one of the companies that was in charge of making this industrial grade alcohol for the war effort was United States Industrial Alcohol. Very aptly named. During the war, they got literally tons and tons and tons of molasses to be made into this like bomb alcohol, this industrial level alcohol. Now, that all needed to go somewhere. Since this was before the war ended, in 1915, United States Industrial Alcohol makes this gigantic tank in right on Commercial Street in the north end of Boston in this highly, populated immigrant area. So they put it up very, very quickly and very, very poorly. They don't use very good materials. They don't really put any thought into it at all, it seems like. And they put all of this molasses in it. And this tank is huge because they have so much molasses, because they're producing so much alcohol, because the war effort is still going on, because we're back in 1915 now. So then they put up this gigantic tank. And let me just tell you the metrics on this thing. The tank was 58 feet tall, which is like 5 stories, a little over a 5-story building tall, 90 feet in diameter, and filled with 2.5 million gallons of crude molasses. Okay, imagine picking up a gallon of milk. Molasses weighs a hell of a lot more than milk does. 2.5 million gallons. Now, when this molasses was originally put into this very poorly made, shoddy, I have pants on, I swear. If you're, it's just shorts, but I just realized it looks like I'm not wearing pants. I am. So when all of this molasses was put into this really shoddy, poorly built tank, it would creak and it would moan and it would shudder and it was leaky. Like there were stories of like little Italian kids taking buckets of molasses that would just collect on the bottom. So this is already great. I'm sure you can see where this is going. It's terrible. There's 2.5 million gallons of molasses in this tank. And now the war is over. So they just have a bunch of extra molasses. And, their United States Industrial Alcohol isn't wanting to waste 2.5 million gallons of molasses. So they're like, okay, well, we can turn this molasses into like drinkable rum. That will be the thing that we do because we're not needing to make as many bombs with the industrial alcohol. We'll make real alcohol. Now, if you know what happens in 1919, the prohibition gets brought to Congress, and it's stated that by January of 1920, there's going to be no more alcohol consumption in the United States whatsoever, or production or anything. No more alcohol. So United States Industrial Alcohol is like, well, shit. And so they just have this giant tank, silo, whatever, of goopy, schloopy, thick molasses that they don't really have anything that they can do with right now. So they're just going to keep it there for a while. Now, it's January 15th, 1919. And it's an unseasonably warm day in January. And this is a really poorly built tank. And if you know anything, I keep saying that. I sound like a fucking asshole. I don't mean to be condescending. I feel like that's just an easy transitional sentence, but I've used it 15 times. When things are hot, especially liquids, they expand. And when tanks are poorly built, they break. So it's a hot day in January, and there is what is described in newspapers the following days and weeks as a thunderclap. So there is a gigantic explosion. It's very loud. And at around 12:30 in the afternoon, when Commercial Street is packed with workers who are getting lunch and doing their daily lives, the USIA molasses tank explodes and sends what has been quoted as being seen as at some points, 40-foot tall giant wave of molasses crashing over this town at 35 miles an hour. I don't know if you've ever been in your car going 35 miles an hour. It's not slow. And it's also like, this is a wave of sticky, thick, impossible to breathe through molasses. This had so much force, it leveled buildings on commercial streets. It filled people's basements in the North End. It killed over 20 people, horses, over 20 people, and then additionally, many more horses, dogs. It injured over 150 people. It filled the streets. It ruined people's businesses. Some of the people who fell victim to this horrible tragedy weren't even able to be identified because the molasses was so thick that they couldn't get to the people. It was absolutely devastatingly insane. First responders rushed to the scene, which included firefighters, police officers, nurses from the Red Cross, some of who were diving into the molasses to help these people, some of who were tending to those who had already been hurt. There were Navy cadets that came and helped. Everybody was there trying to help. Makeshift hospitals were built in surrounding areas, like in little buildings, so that these poor victims could be treated as quickly as possible because a lot of the hospitals filled up. And that's not even all of it. Because think about it. It's like, I don't know if you guys saw, I did, wow, what a time to bring up 9/11. I did a video about the unsung heroes of 9/11, who I believe are there are many heroes in that situation, but the sanitation workers who dealt with the cleanup of that, because we remember this horrible, unspeakable tragedy that occurred. But we remember that. We remember the tragedy. What's often looked over is how these things get figured out and sorted out and cleaned up. And the sanitation workers were doing it there, and the first responders and sanitation workers and stuff as well were doing it during this 1919 molasses flood. Because, okay, the initial thing happens. There's the 40-foot wave. There's the 35-mile-an-hour crash of molasses. But, okay, now things have settled. The molasses has settled. Some people have died. Some people have broken limbs. So much is happening. Okay, now what? Now we have a full-ass city filled with molasses. What, you can't get into your house. You can't get into your basement. You can't walk down the street. What the fuck are you supposed to do? And I'll tell you what, they tried a lot of things. They tried using buckets to scoop the molasses up, but where they it's a bucket at a time, okay? Wasn't doing great. They tried to use water, but the water could not penetrate the molasses. Now, not the one good thing, this is just how it is. One of the silver linings of this situation is that Commercial Street and the North End are right on Boston Harbor. So it is right against the ocean, right against the harbor. And this brilliant firefighter was like, what if we pump this salt water from the ocean and see if that can break up the molasses? And that works. Thank God. So they are doing this cleanup for weeks and weeks and weeks. They are pouring salt water onto the molasses, trying to get the molasses cleared out of the streets, pushing it back into the harbor. So the Boston harbor is brown with molasses. Some people say for months. Some people say almost up to a year. Now, what's also crazy, what we might not be thinking about, is like, this isn't just now contained, you know, like, and it's not like they have a shower that they can all go into before they go home. They're going in, cleaning up this molasses, cleaning up this disaster, and tracking it now all throughout Boston. So it's said that like in 1919, somebody from Boston couldn't touch something without it being sticky. And it makes sense. Like all of the subways, all of the streets, you're tracking it on your shoes. You have it on your clothes. Just an absolute disaster. So crazy. This was a huge event in history for two reasons. One, this was the first major class action lawsuit that America sees, because a lot of people, rightfully so, are livid with United States industrial alcohol and are like, you f***ing killed, my kid is injured, somebody died, like my horse got killed because you didn't have your shit together and you didn't make this tank stable to hold all this molasses. It shouldn't matter that it got hot one day. So there's a major class action lawsuit, and that's like a big thing that, you know, led the way for a lot of other class action lawsuits that happened. And another one of the most important things that this horrible tragedy, you know, brought was a ton of regulations on buildings and structures that are created in public spaces for safety, of course. The Great Boston Molasses flood was pretty much the impetus for all building codes and regulations that we have now. That's why we need to have licensed architects who sign off on their work. We have to have civil engineers that are on site making sure things are going right. And it's so that these horrible things don't happen again. And of course there are accidents, and of course there are things that still happen. But thankfully, there hasn't been something like that since. But I knew nothing about this, you guys. I had no idea this happened. It's so crazy. It's also said, people said that even decades after this horrible incident, when it got hot enough in the summer, it still smelled like molasses in this area of Boston, in the North End, which is insane. I'm just so curious. This one really blew my mind. I was shocked learning about this story. So tell me in the comments below, or this might be a good time to leave a 5-star review just while we're at it. Tell me in the comments below if you guys have heard about this or if you know any other facts about it, because I was really fascinated by it. Just an insane story. Oh my gosh, I got too excited to tell you that I forgot to thank everybody. Thank you so much to the This Week in History podcast, which is a History Channel podcast that I've actually started listening to a lot of them, and they're great. Thehistorychannel.com, pbs.org, britannica.com, and wikipedia.org. And also, of course, thank you so much to my patrons. I love you very much. You guys are very special to me. I'm very grateful to have you in here. If you guys want to check out the Patreon, it starts at just $2 a month to help support this podcast. So thank you all for doing that. I love you guys. I hope you just have the most wonderful day. I hope you are extra grateful to be able to take a shower today and not be covered in molasses, because I know that I am.